Hello everybody, and welcome to the presentation that I will be doing for you guys about supplements. In particular, this presentation, as it exists here, is going to talk a little bit about supplements that are within my scope of interest, supplements for weight loss and diabetes. Of course, two conditions that I as a clinician see a great deal of. So these are things that I'm interested in, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how to approach information for supplements that you may have an interest in for other conditions. So hopefully you can take the way I look at this information and use it to approach any supplement that you might find yourself investigating. So in terms of our learning objectives for this particular presentation, I want you to get a sense of how these supplements work, otherwise called the mechanism of action. And that's an important piece of sort of how these things come into play. It's some of the things that, we think they may have a particular action, and then people become curious and interested in these things. And I'll tell you a little bit about how these supplements get noticed in the first place. We're going to take a look at some of the risks and interactions and some of the downsides of these supplements, if indeed they do work. So we're going to look at the safety aspect of the supplements. And then we're going to fairly rigorously examine the information that exists for the efficacy of the supplements. What is the research, what is the information, and how are those conclusions drawn, and what conclusions can we draw from the research, not just if these supplements are marketed persuasively, but using our own judgments to look at the research and draw some conclusions. So as we start to look at all of these dietary supplements, I want you folks to be able to take away some implications to the broader world of supplements. And of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of supplements that are available, if you were to walk into any health food store, if you will, today. So you guys may find yourselves being confronted with things that we certainly are not going to have the time to discuss fully in this class, but I want to set you up with a framework on kind of understanding what supplements are, what are the rules surrounding them, and then what is a good scientific way of looking through that information, as I mentioned in the very beginning of this presentation. So it's important to note that some supplements are very, very highly studied and have had a lot of good quality scientific information generated about them through randomized controlled trials. Some of this stuff is really just purely theoretical. As you'll see with the supplements that we talk about in this presentation, a lot of the sort of initial spark of interest that arises for these supplements comes from either noting cultural usage of certain substances. Some of these cultural uses say, a particular tribe of peoples have used this type of tree bark to help with pain for generations. Some of them are indeed truthful. Some of them, however, are, let's say, highly embellished stories in terms of the real prominence of use of these supplements within a particular culture. I think when marketers get a hold of this information, they can really figure out ways to sort of extend it and embellish it quite a bit. What's important for you folks to understand is what rules govern dietary supplements in America at this particular time. So right now, dietary supplements are governed under what's called the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, or we might refer to it as DSHEA. And that was a piece of legislation put forth in 1994. And long story short on DSHEA is that it decided that supplements are foods, not drugs. So they are exempt from the testing and labeling requirements that drugs must undergo. So, which are much more stringent and much more regulated in terms of both the testing as well as what they need to put and how they're categorized. So basically that's why when you go to the pharmacy and you pick up a medication, you have almost 100% certainty that what that says on the label of that medication is indeed what is contained within those tablets or capsules that are in the bottle, because of that strong, strict regulation. Supplements do not have that same regulation behind them. So because they are classified as food and not drugs, they do not need to show proof of either safety or efficacy in order to market these supplements. Basically, they could put water in a jar and market to you as anything they darn well pleased, because they do not have to show any kind of proof, scientific or otherwise, that this particular substance does a gosh golly darn thing for you. Frighteningly, they also don't have to prove to you that it's safe. Again, there's no clinical testing, preclinical testing that needs to go on for these things. So they don't have to be safe. You take it into your own hands when you take a dietary supplements. Because of that, it is interesting to note that many supplements that are out there on the market are potentially adulterated and not standardized. So even though it may say on the label that you're getting, say, 100 milligrams of a particular supplement, you may be getting 500 milligrams in one tablet and 2 milligrams in another tablet. Unless the individual maker or manufacturer of that supplement tells you that they have standardized their ingredients and certifies it with an agency on under their impetus. Okay, if they voluntarily have to do all this stuff. So unless they do that through a qualified agency, and there's a few of them that are out there, we really have no indication that these substances are what they say they are in the amounts that they say are contained within them. So I will get you guys some more information about DSHEA. It's kind of interesting to really look at the specifics of this act. But the idea is that they basically label them like foodstuffs. So they have to put what's in them in descending order of weight on a label, same as a food label. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually in there. What's interesting is that there is a proposal for some changes to this original legislation that was proposed in 2011 that actually proposes to kind of tighten up on some of this information, meaning that what they want to do is that the ingredients would need to be registered with the FDA, and the manufacturer would have to list all ingredients, as well as identify any ingredients that are linked to serious adverse events and risks. They would also be forced to disclose the makeup of proprietary blends. In particular, if one of the ingredients or more of the ingredients in the blend has been linked to safety issues. And so really, what this proposed change does, it doesn't propose to increase a consumer's confidence in the efficacy or the fact that the dietary supplement works, but it is hopefully would increase the safety, sort of the regulations that would govern and assure some of the safety of some of the ingredients within dietary supplements. So important stuff, definitely to look into and to keep in mind as you delve into the world of dietary supplements. So if you go out there and look through the world of supplements aimed at both weight loss and diabetes, what you'll see is there's just a whole variety of things. Everything from proprietary blends that are available on the shelf that, of course, use words like glucose and insulin and, of course, the buzzwords of diabetes. But there's also, of course, books aimed at people who are maybe hesitant, maybe feel like they're kind of drowning in the medications that we utilize to help take care of diabetes, and who potentially want an alternative. And of course, this is a sort of a human endeavor to kind of want to have an alternative for different things. In fact, if you take a look, there's even supplements marketed for animals. So definitely it's an interesting situation, and has definitely turned even into a big business opportunity for people who are making and writing these things that are getting to people. And of course, I've always held this opinion about books in particular, is that these folks have no investment in the people who are buying their books. They get the money from the book, and then whoever the author is doesn't have to be worried if this never works for the person that bought the book. Whereas my experience as a clinician have told me that I have a vested interest in getting my patients well, from both a personal and a professional standpoint. I am invested in those patients. And so that leads me to try to recommend the best treatments, regardless of where they came from. And for the most part, most of my clinical experience for the last, say, 8 years has been volunteer. So I'm not making any money off of these folks. So I always just kind of think of that as kind of a different perspective. And so you may ask me where I got the substances that we're going to talk about in this particular presentation. And I really wanted to kind of share with you my sources, in a sense, which is paying attention to the popular media, kind of trying to continue to have my finger on the pulse of what people are talking about, of what people are interested in. As a nutritionist and as a pharmacist, I'm regularly questioned by people about all sorts of substances, and I find the most difficult ones are not the ones that have been around for quite some time and I've had some time to look at, but kind of the new ones. And so I'm actually going to take a little bit of approach to both of these types of substances in this presentation. So of course our buddy Dr. Oz, Dr. Weil, Reader's Digest, my grandmother's favorite source of health information when she was alive. Great sources still of ridiculous hype and things. But other than that, just kind of trolling the web a little bit, and of course having that clinical experience is where I'm getting the inspiration for the substances in this talk. So when I talk about evidence in this presentation, it really comes down to a technique of trying to use the best evidence that is able to be found about a particular topic, and kind of looking at it from a pyramid approach, in a sense. So what's the weakest evidence when you're talking about true scientific truth of the matter, and what's the strongest evidence? So ideally, I would search for things at the top of the pyramid. So synthesized information about the body of evidence, which is really contained within two study types called meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So where researchers really try to look at the entire body of evidence and put all of those numbers together and try to come up with large statistical data sets that allow them to really see what the truth is, kind of to drop all of the bias that individual scientific studies may have, or at least balance that bias out by using other studies. If those studies are not available, if this type of evidence is not available, then I would kind of work my way down the pyramid to, sort of other types of evidence that are considered strong, including randomized controlled clinical trials. And then kind of finally, it's the bulk of dietary supplement evidence usually exists in the form of animal or mechanistic, so lab studies or in vitro examination of these substances. So where that was compelling or well done, I used that as the evidence that we're going to look at in this presentation. And of course, I'll tell you what type of evidence we are looking at for each supplement. Also, for each supplement, I try to do this in a particular way so that you guys can see how I'm approaching things. But what I'm going to do is provide you with the name, a little bit of the backstory of each supplement, tell you a little bit about how we think it may work, talk about the evidence that exists for that supplement, talk a little bit about the benefits and risks that are known about the particular supplement, and then try to bring it all down to reasonable advice for the patient or the layperson to kind of come away with. What's the bottom line on each supplement that we do that we can conclude from all of this information that we look at. So just a little comic break, of course. I enjoy those, but what we're really going to kind of do is start with the supplements that are really pertinent to diabetes first. So the first supplement that we're going to talk about is cinnamon. And of course, cinnamon is one of these supplements that are talked about pretty heavily for use in diabetes. So the first thing to note is what cinnamon really is, and it's the inner bark of a particular type of tree that goes by the name Cinnamomum verum. There's actually a related species of cinnamon that comes from a tree called the cassia tree, and believe it or not, you can actually find these two different types of cinnamon in different places. In fact, cassia cinnamon, so not even, if you will, true cinnamon, is the primary type of cinnamon that is found and used in the US and Canada. And you can tell the difference between cassia and ceylon, or the true cinnamon, by how the spice actually looks. So cassia cinnamon tends to be much thicker, harder, and have hollow curls or coils of that inner bark, versus ceylon cinnamon, which is a lot thinner, softer, and tends to have more paper-like sheets within the curls or coils of the cinnamon when it's dried. So, of course, cinnamon has been used since ancient times, and it's been known both as a spice, also as a folk medicine. And what we think is that most of the activity of cinnamon is attributable to a compound called cinnamonaldehyde. So it's an aldehyde particular to cinnamon. And the way we think it works is that we actually think cinnamon works very similarly to drugs that we use for diabetes called thiazolidinediones, which the drugs in the class that we have are pioglitazone, which is also called Actos as a brand name, or rosiglitazone, which is Avandia as a brand name. And so they work through increasing the expression of a particular molecule called PPARY. And what these things do is they basically enhance insulin sensitivity. So the best evidence that I was able to find for cinnamon comes from an updated systematic review and meta-analysis from 2013. And this really hits the highest tier of evidence that is available for a supplement. So that synthesized body of evidence. What it looked at was trials through February 2012, and they had 10 randomized controlled trials that they looked at. And for these randomized controlled trials, they used any oral formulation of cinnamon in order to affect the measurements around diabetes, including everything from the measurements of how diabetes is controlled through blood sugar, fasting plasma glucose, hemoglobin A1C, which is a 3-month measurement of sort of average blood sugar, if you will, as well as lipid profile numbers. So cholesterol, high density lipoprotein, low density lipoprotein, triglyceride numbers. So really it was mostly surrogate markers of diabetic control that they looked at with all of these randomized controlled trials. And also these randomized controlled trials were also irrespective of other interventions. So the patients could have been on other medications or have had other interventions for their diabetes, but we're also using cinnamon. So the good part about that is that it sort of adequately mimics the real world usage of a supplement like cinnamon. It would be extremely unusual for somebody to be treating their diabetes only with cinnamon, and probably quite unhelpful to do so. So it really looked at its efficacy in light of sort of other common treatments. They did a subgroup analysis of powder versus capsules, so trying to get a sense of what dosage form of cinnamon might actually be most useful. And as I said, the endpoints that they looked at were measures of blood sugar and lipid control in diabetes. So what I would like to introduce to you here is something called a forest plot. And this is a type of statistical analysis that systematic reviews and meta-analyses will use to give a sense of what the data says overall. And what you'll see here is each little dot or square going down the lines is the results of one particular trial. And you can see there's a list of trials that correspond with each dot or square. If those dots or squares fall to the left side of the zero line, which is the line right in the center, that means that trial showed a favorable effect of the drug, in this case of cinnamon. If it falls to the right, it means that the control was actually favored. So in a sense, you could say the cinnamon had potentially even deleterious effects. If you can see the lines that go through each dot or square, those are the lines of the confidence intervals. So that's kind of the statistical uncertainty that we possess. Long story short, if the dot or the square or the line through it touches that line of zero, then statistically we can say that there is no difference between the experimental substance and nothing, or the control. And what you can see here is that for each different outcome that they looked at, they did one of these forest plots. And then the very bottom one, sort of the open diamond, is when you put all those numbers together, what does the body of evidence say about the cinnamon affect the particular outcome that you're looking for? So what you'll see, if you take a look at the first one, is we're looking at hemoglobin A1C. And then as we move through, you can actually see that the bottom line, or the open diamond, favors cinnamon just a little bit, but it does still barely cross that line of zero, meaning it is statistically non-significant. So it might help, but the statistics cannot say that it absolutely does at this point. The second outcome that we're looking at on this slide is the fasting plasma glucose. And you can see here that the open diamond actually does fall fully onto the side of favoring cinnamon, meaning that we can say with statistical certainty that supplementing cinnamon for a person with diabetes can help them with fasting plasma glucose control. That doesn't mean to make it normal, but it means it can help within whatever parameter we decide is useful. So here are the other surrogate markers that this particular study looked at with regard to cinnamon. And I'm going to move you through it here. So total cholesterol, it had just a barely favorable effect, but it does not cross that line, so it is statistically appropriate. LDL cholesterol, again, a barely favorable effect. And as that box moves farther and farther to the left, that means that effect is bigger. So it had very, very small effects on these numbers, although again, they were statistically significant, so we can call them real. If we look at HDL, or good cholesterol, it actually had almost a slightly worsening effect. So doing nothing was better. And you can see that from the diamond being farther over on the right. And then for triglycerides, it had a modest favorable effect. So the bottom line from all of this, from this particular meta-analysis of some good randomized controlled trials of cinnamon, really do say that cinnamon may have a slightly beneficial effect on both fasting plasma glucose and a slightly beneficial effect on lipid parameters in type 2 diabetes. Now, to put this in perspective, it's important. The authors actually looked at compared in their discussion how much cinnamon lowered all of these numbers versus popular drugs that we use to do so. And I'll tell you that it lowered the numbers and improved the numbers by approximately 20% as compared to a drug. 20% of a drug's effect, I should say. So if a drug, say, lowered the fasting plasma glucose by about 60 points, cinnamon possibly lowered the fasting plasma glucose about 20 points. So maybe 20 to 30% of the drug's effectiveness. One of the limitations of this is that the trials were done in all different types of populations. So we don't know if the cinnamon may be beneficial for, say, postmenopausal women more so than teenagers with type 2 diabetes. We're not sure. We can't tell from this particular set of data what population might benefit most from cinnamon. I will also say that the dosage forms were pretty varied within the different trials, but certainly the dosage forms were all in the form of a strict cinnamon supplement, a powder or a capsule, and not in the form of a cinnamon roll. Patients were also taking in quite a bit more cinnamon than you would find in a foodstuff. So I've had patients tell me, oh, I can just add cinnamon to my oatmeal, right? And that will help. Well, it might taste good, but it's probably not near enough to actually have any beneficial effect. So something in terms of a bottom line for patients is that it's potentially useful. It's important to note that cassia cinnamon or true cinnamon has the potential to actually mimic anticoagulation drugs and can potentially harm people's livers. And also, if you take cinnamon as a powder, you can get skin rashes, contact rashes, or even breathing problems if you actually inhale that cinnamon into your lungs or get it onto your skin. So the next supplement we're going to talk about is vitamin D. And vitamin D is a vitamin. It's a substance that exists in two forms. So there's ergocalciferol and cholecalciferol. Really, cholecalciferol is the active or the animal source of vitamin D. And believe it or not, we as human beings can synthesize vitamin D, as you may remember. And we can do that through ultraviolet activation of substances that our bodies already produce. And we've known about the deficiency of vitamin D since antiquity, because we realized that people developed a particular deficiency state, also called rickets, which was characterized by very soft bones. But it really wasn't until the 1920s that its function as a true vitamin was figured out. But believe it or not, we've been figuring out that vitamin D has links to many, many other things. And we've noticed epidemiologic links. So we've done big surveys of large populations of people, and we've noticed that, say, cultures where there's a low exposure to sunlight have different risks of diseases than cultures with, say, high vitamin D levels, both from getting a lot of sunlight as well as people looking and doing laboratory tests and looking for, say, low serum levels of vitamin D. So epidemiologically, people linked low vitamin D levels with risks of getting diabetes, as well as changes in diabetic control once people actually had diabetes. So that kind of sparked the interest in vitamin D as a supplement to improve diabetes. So as I mentioned, people had noticed there was an epidemiologic link between diabetes and vitamin D. And so if we were to extrapolate from that epidemiologic evidence, we would say that for every 10 millimole per liter increase in vitamin D3 levels, we've been able to statistically correlate that with approximately a 4% decrease in the risk of type 2 diabetes. And so I was able to look at a meta-analysis of vitamin D effects on glycemic control. Now, this is not the risk of developing diabetes and supplementation aimed at reducing the chance of actually developing diabetes. This is looking at vitamin D in established diabetics and seeing how that affects their glycemic control. So what this is some of the tables similar to the tables that we saw for cinnamon. Again, you'll notice the forest plots, the results of the meta-analysis looking at the different randomized controlled trials. And these tables actually break up these randomized the results for each outcome into the outcomes for patients either with normal fasting glucose, so patients who did not have diabetes, as well as patients who had abnormal glucose tolerance, so patients who were pre-diabetic in a sense. So what you can see is that the first table, the upper table, is actually looking at fasting blood glucose, so an important measure in diabetes and whether or not vitamin D had any effect. So for patients who had normal fasting blood glucose, vitamin D had absolutely no effect. But for patients who had abnormal glucose tolerance or prediabetes, vitamin D did have a small positive effect on lowering their fasting blood glucose. The second table is looking at, overall led up to basically no effect, so right on that line of 0. The second table looked at hemoglobin A1C, or sort of a long-term measure of blood glucose control. And overall, what you looked at is for patients who had prediabetes, because patients who had normal blood sugar wouldn't need this type of measurement, but it had no effect on their sort of long-term blood glucose control. So when you look at the potential risks of vitamin D supplementation, it has very, very modest improvements, if any, but there's potential hypercalcemia, although there's usually relatively few risks with usual levels of supplementation for patients. So it's a pretty low risk supplement to try, even though it doesn't appear to do very much. And recommendations would be that this vitamin D supplementation may be useful, though it's quite possible that increasing vitamin D intake through diet and exercise exposure to the sun may be particularly beneficial. Again, we did notice that it does have an epidemiologic link, but that doesn't always translate into supplementation. It usually translates into increased environmental exposure that potentially led to the epidemiologic observations. So the next supplement we're going to look at is magnesium, and magnesium is a mineral that we look at as an essential mineral for the human body. And you can get magnesium from supplements, but also from different food items, including whole grains, nuts, and leafy green vegetables. And what we know is that magnesium plays a role as a cofactor for more than 300 enzymatic reactions in the body, so it has a number of roles within the body. Similar to vitamin D, we notice that there is an epidemiologic intake between high levels of magnesium intake and lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. We also, sort of augmenting that observation, we have seen that many people who had diabetes, when you test their magnesium levels, they are shown to be hypomagnesiemic. They have low magnesium levels in their blood. We think that it works through somehow affecting insulin secretion and action of insulin, although the specifics of that have not been well elucidated. What we do know, evidence tells us that if you take oral magnesium, it will raise your magnesium level, regardless of how you take it, injectable pills, intravenous, etc. So it's a little bit of an obvious reaction, but sometimes that's what scientific research can actually tell us about a supplement, just as that it raises your levels, not that it results in any different health outcomes. So this is the result of a meta-analysis for magnesium, and what it's looking at, for the left, it's looking at the overall effect of magnesium on hemoglobin A1C levels, and that's right there, that open diamond, and you can see it actually looks slightly positive, but it does cross the line of 0, so it is not statistically significant. And then the second graph, or B, is fasting plasma glucose levels, and you can see again that that diamond looks kind of good, and it just barely bumps up to the line of 0, so it does have potentially a slight effect on improving fasting plasma glucose for patients with type 2 diabetes. So bottom line for magnesium is that what we can tell you is that magnesium supplementation raises magnesium levels, and it may potentially reduce a little bit of your fasting plasma glucose. It also, and I didn't show you this graph, but it may potentially raise HDL, or good cholesterol, just a little bit. However, it has very little effect, no statistically significant effect on long-term glycemic control. Some of the limitations of this particular meta-analysis is that most of the randomized controlled trials weren't designed very well. So we may not actually have been able to detect an effect of magnesium if there was one. So the recommendations that I have for patients is that, sure, magnesium supplement might be helpful. However, eating higher quality whole foods, again, if you think about where those epidemiologic observations probably came from, that is probably Also very good advice. And just to be aware for your patients or people looking at taking magnesium is that magnesium may actually have laxative effects when you supplement with oral magnesium. So another supplement that was looked at for diabetes is Alpha-Lipoic Acid. And this has been an interesting supplement that we've looked at. It's actually a racemic mixture of two very closely related chemicals, and it's typically found in a variety of dietary sources. All the supplements, though, are synthetic. There's no way to actually extract alpha-lipoic acid and create it into a dietary supplement. So these are purely synthetic supplements that people are taking. It's been used in Germany for quite a while, and in fact, they've got some named studies. Now, you know, if a study gets a name, it's a relatively high status study, if you will. So they have done some named studies on IV administration of alpha-lipoic acid. And believe it or not, that's what we're going to look at. Its proposed mechanism is that it can help, it has a great deal of antioxidant capacity. So it helps to potentially regenerate and destroy toxins within the body. It can also stabilize the insulin receptor. Focus for diabetes with the supplement, however, has not been on glycemic control, but has been on its use in the treatment of peripheral neuropathy, which is a very common long-term side effect of diabetes. So I looked at a variety of meta-analyses for this particular supplement, and what you can say is that when you look at IV administration of alpha-lipoic acid, now just to make note, these forest plots are in a slightly different orientation, meaning favors treatment or having the treatment have a favorable effect is going to be on the right side of the line of zero. And so what we can actually see is that you can see that, of course, the bottom line of all of these studies falls way over into the favors treatment side for both of them. And what these are looking at is nerve conduction velocities. So we can actually measure how fast nerves conduct their electric potentials. However, most patients wouldn't be able to tell you, oh, I can say that my nerve conduction velocity has improved on this supplement. Most patients are going to be aware of, are they suffering less from the symptoms of their neuropathy rather than from looking at this kind of abstract measurement. And so believe it or not, if we look at the next slide, and so you can see here that when we start to look at something that patients actually care about, which is, do they feel pain from their neuropathy, you can see that intravenously administered alpha-lipoic acid still has a favorable effect. And again, the forest plots are switched back to the traditional way in this particular slide. One thing to note is that the researchers used very, very high dosages of intravenous, not by mouth, ALA for these particular studies. So the bottom line is that we really only have good, what we call patient-oriented evidence that matters, or stuff that people care about, a reduction in pain. We only have that evidence for alpha-lipoic acid with IV therapy at high doses. So fortunately and unfortunately, it's useful, but it may only be an option for patients if they have a practitioner who's willing to try to administer them this basically non-FDA approved drug at this point in time intravenously. So if they feel like taking oral supplementation, I usually wouldn't discourage them. The only safety concern is potential for a skin rash, but at the same time, the data does not exist for oral data with alpha-lipoic acid. So now we're going to look at a few less studied supplements for diabetes. The first one is Fenugreek, and it goes by a variety of different names. It's a plant, it's an annual plant, and you might be familiar with it from its use in Indian cuisine. And of course, it's been used for millennia as a part of that particular cuisine. It's also very popular as a supplement to stimulate breastfeeding. So that's not something we're talking about in this presentation, but it is another popular use for Fenugreek. And of course, that would require looking at a whole separate set of data for it. And of course, we seem to think that it has a variety of effects on diabetes, including lowering the blood sugar by inhibiting the formation of new blood sugar within the liver. So again, a variety of proposed mechanisms. We think that it has some effect on insulin and glucose uptake as well. But what we also know is that fenugreek seeds are actually very high in soluble fiber. And if you recall from earlier in the class, soluble fiber can actually modulate the entrance of carbohydrate from the gastrointestinal tract. It can slow down the absorption of sugars, which can potentially modulate a person's blood sugar. So it might have an effect through its soluble fiber content as well. So the evidence that I was able to find for fenugreek is just a very few small clinical trials, some randomized, but most of it is fairly low in quality. And also the supplement was really variable in the type of preparation they used, the dose, and what they actually looked at. So there was not a lot of evidence on its efficacy. Its safety is something that it potentially can cause an allergy risk, particularly if there are flowers from the plant included within the supplement. It can have some GI effects. It can give people some upset stomach diarrhea. It also has a very strong maple syrup odor. So people will, if they're taking the supplement, begin to have a body odor that smells vaguely of maple syrup. So just in case people are wondering about that. And also because it does have a high soluble fiber content, it can actually impair the absorption of other medications. So the bottom line on the evidence on fenugreek is that it's interesting, but we certainly do not have enough evidence to say anywhere near that it has any efficacy whatsoever for diabetes. Chromium, an interesting supplement. It has a few different forms that it comes in, and really what we're looking at is trivalent chromium. Hexavalent chromium is extremely toxic. It's thought that it has a cofactor in glucose tolerance, and a lot of what this came from was the notation that back in the early days of total parenteral nutrition, we had patients who had been maintained on limited nutritional intake for a very long time, and they had developed symptoms of diabetes. It was then discovered that they were deficient in a variety of trace nutrients, chromium among them, and when chromium was administered, it helped correct these diabetic symptoms. We also have epidemiologic evidence that lower tissue levels are correlated with a decreased diabetes and heart attack risk. So it's thought that the chromium helps the insulin receptor, and chromium was actually a big part of the U.S. mineral supplement sales. So 6% of that market, I was able to find that data. So when we take chromium and we look at, again, a meta-analysis of studies looking at its effect on hemoglobin A1C, or the long-term control for diabetes, here's what we find. And you can see the studies are somewhat variable. Some favor the chromium. Some are at the line of equality or the line of zero, saying there's no effect. What we're able to see is actually the researchers for this meta-analysis took the studies and they broke them down. And what they noticed is that the higher quality or quality A studies were much closer to the line of no effect. The lowest quality studies, quality C, showed a favorable effect of chromium. So when the studies were more tightly controlled, they showed less of an effect for the supplement. Also, industry-sponsored studies tend to show more of an effect for the supplement, whereas non-industry studies showed much less, in fact, a non-statistically significant effect of the supplement. So the study actually the meta-analysis broke the studies down into studies that looked at patients with diabetes, with impaired fasting glucose, and without diabetes. And for the patients that did have diabetes, when you look at the change in fasting plasma glucose, you'll notice that all of them basically favored chromium just a little bit, and there wasn't as much difference in terms of the quality of studies, although you can see, of course, that the industry-sponsored studies definitely favored chromium more than the non-industry sponsored. So I looked at another meta-analysis for chromium, and what we've noticed is that chromium doesn't really affect long-term control through the hemoglobin A1C, but it can reduce fasting blood sugar. benefit and risk of this supplement is that there's no evidence for use in patients without diabetes. There have been case reports of kidney failure, and very, very high doses have been used. So we have had people take high doses. What I do worry about is the source of the chromium supplement, because as I said, hexavalent chromium is extremely toxic. And if you are having a patient obtain a chromium supplement from a non-certified source, there's the potential for, again, adulteration. So I worry about that with such a toxic cousin to the substance of interest. So again, my bottom line here is that caution should be taken with the source and the substance of chromium that you are choosing to supplement with. So again, we kind of are getting into some of the more unique and less studied supplements for diabetes. And we're going to touch on bitter melon. So bitter melon goes by a variety of names. You can see them listed in the first line here. It's interestingly called vegetable insulin. It's actually a plant that's been used a lot in Asian cuisine, but it also has a long history of medicinal use by multiple cultures. So again, that's where the interest in this plant came from. We think it has some activity that's similar to insulin. And it's got some, I've got some other statements down here. So it has a variety of proposed mechanisms that it potentially works through. So there actually, believe it or not, is a Cochrane review available, which is a high quality standardized review that has been done for this. And by the way, the picture there is a ripe bitter melon. So when it's ripe, it sort of splits open and spills these red seeds out. What they had was 4 randomized controlled trials with a total of 479 patients that looked at any preparation of bitter melon being used for diabetes control, and it was compared with placebo or no treatment, and with or without other medications. So a little bit of heterogeneity in the comparison group here. And they looked at, of course, fasting plasma glucose, hemoglobin A1C, and a few other biochemical markers, but they also looked at morbidity and quality of life as well. So back to our familiar forest plots, and I know these are a little small, so they're a little bit hard to see, but if you take a look at the results of this Cochrane review, you'll notice that there is absolutely no difference in terms of the change of hemoglobin A1C or that long-term blood sugar control, as well as in the differences in fasting blood glucose. So what we can say is that it probably does nothing as a supplement. It appears to be safe as a food item, though, and you can see I have a picture of a beautiful salad with bitter melon, which I've never had, but looks delicious. It does have some potential to have GI issues when taken as a supplement. There have been some reports of hypoglycemia in children, oddly enough, consuming a lot of this particular type of soda that has a bitter melon flavoring. So I'm not really sure what's at work there, but it's definitely something to keep in mind, and this apparently is available in Asia. So again, not enough information to recommend as a supplement for diabetes, but definitely could be an interesting inclusion into a diet if people are willing to have it. And of course, eating more fruits and vegetables, always a good idea. All right, so finally we're moving on to supplements for weight loss. And one of the most interesting ones is raspberry ketone. And I know this has been talked about a lot lately. Of course, a big interest of Dr. Oz and the rest. So raspberry ketone, if you kind of go back to my typical approach to this, it goes by a variety of different names. And you can see there are some chemical names there. What it is a naturally phenolic compound of red raspberry. And a phenolic compound usually denotes something that has some fragrance to it. It tends to be the types of compounds that get liberated so that our nose can smell them. So you smell red raspberry, you might be smelling raspberry ketone. It's something that it's not only found in raspberries. Different flowers use it as an attractant for bugs, and we actually use it as a fragrance and a food additive. Now, believe it or not, some animals actually produce this particular chemical. And because we use it as a food additive, people have figured out ways to extract this chemical, in particularly from the anal glands of a beaver. Believe it or not, it's called castoreum. And one of the main chemicals in castoreum, which is a secretion from the anal glands of a beaver, is this particular chemical that we now call raspberry ketone. So believe it or not, if you're drinking, say, a raspberry soda or eating food with raspberry flavoring in it, and it says natural flavorings because it can be labeled as a natural flavoring, you could totally be eating beaver anal gland secretion because it's allowed to be called natural flavoring, and they do use it. They also use a lot of synthetic raspberry ketone these days as flavoring, but if it's labeled natural, that's potentially where it's coming from. So we think it can actually increase the lipolytic activity, the breakdown of fat in fat cells. So when I went looking for evidence on raspberry ketone, I came up with extremely limited animal and cell culture evidence, absolutely no clinical trials in humans. And what this evidence was able to show is that there was potential for increased fatty acid oxidation, lipolysis, and potentially increased adiponectin, or a hormone that comes from fat secretion. However, none of this, of course, was in humans. All of it, again, was in very limited, say, cell culture evidence, which doesn't tell us a hoot about if this works in real life. So the conclusions are likely ineffective. There's really no safety concerns with this that I'm aware of, and again, that's partly due to its very limited amount of evidence in humans. So the next kind of hot supplement for weight loss that I took a look at for this was white bean extract, and a lot of times this goes under some names. The actual scientific name of the plant is Phaseolus vulgaris. The supplements tend to go under names of phase 2, carb intercept, and a variety of other brand names. Apologize for my yawn there. And what it's thought is that this actually blocks starch from being broken down to simple sugars in the intestine and therefore digested, because your body cannot digest, as you remember learning from our earlier modules, large molecules of starch. It has to break it down into sugars in order to digest it. So what I was able to find for this is that some higher quality evidence did exist. In fact, there was a randomized control trial in humans. What they found was non-significant, non-statistically significant differences in weight loss between the group that took the supplement and the group that had a placebo. What you can see is that the amount of weight loss that they had was relatively small, and again, not statistically significant between the two things. So we're not sure if this supplement actually does anything. However, there were a lot of methodologic flaws in the trials. So from this, I'm going to conclude that white bean extract might possibly be helpful in weight loss efforts. So a forest plot, I was able to find some synthesis of some of these smaller trials to put together, and a forest plot of this information shows just a little bit of favorability towards towards white bean extract on both body weight and body fat. And you can see that the one on body weight actually just barely touches the line of zero, meaning it was still statistically non-significant, but again, it looks favorable. Okay, our next weight loss supplement is Garcinia Cambogia. Believe it or not, this goes by the more normal name, which some of you may recognize if you are foodies, of tamarind. And believe it or not, what they're looking at with tamarind is actually a part of the particular tamarind, which is used in cuisine. It has sort of a sweet tart flavor, but they're looking at a component of it called HCA, or hydroxycitric acid. And most commercial supplements are approximately 60% of this hydroxycitric acid. And it's thought to affect serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that actually also works in the gut and regulates appetite. And it's thought to potentially even be dose dependent, meaning the more you take, the more it will work. So the body of evidence for Garcinia is fairly limited. There's one good human randomized controlled trial, and the conclusions from that trial were that there was no effect on any of the parameters that they studied, which are the second bullet point there that are listed, with the exception of a little bit of lowering of the good cholesterol. HDL, which is actually not a good finding to have. So this particular substance also, what they're looking at in green coffee bean is a portion of it. So what's called chlorogenic acid. And a lot of the supplements are standardized to approximately 45%. The mechanism, we think, is that it inhibits fat absorption and increases fat metabolism. The only evidence that we have for this is very limited mechanistic and animal evidence. And so from what I'm going to conclude from this is that it's very likely ineffective. We just do not have enough scientific evidence to say that it does anything. And also because of its limited exposure in terms of human evidence, we don't really have any safety data for it either. So finally, this really brings us to kind of the mainstay of weight loss supplements, which is caffeine. And believe it or not, most weight loss supplements that are on the market these days contain caffeine in some form or another. Dexatrim, hydroxycut, kind of the big name brand weight loss supplements all contain caffeine, as well as caffeine is usually found in a variety of proprietary blends that different weight loss supplements that you're going to find in any store would have. It actually comes not only under the name of caffeine, but it can come from other, say, quote-unquote, natural sources as well. And so when we're looking at substances or supplements that have things in them that go under the names guarana, yerba mate, green tea, and you can see from the little table I have on this slide a whole variety of other names, cola, theosinensis, etc. All of these are names for caffeine-containing substances. Either they are plants that naturally contain caffeine, or they are synthetic sources of caffeine that we put into supplements. And what we think the mechanism of action of caffeine really is an increased metabolism. So potentially allowing us to burn more energy as heat, and also to have more increased energy, which might increase our activity levels, allowing us to burn more calories. So for caffeine, just to keep in mind that an average cup of coffee that the American person drinks, now this is cup 8 ounces, not a cup from Starbucks, which is different, it contains about 150 milligrams of caffeine. Studies looking at caffeine for weight loss have looked at somewhere around 3 to 15 milligrams per kilogram. And it's actually shown a positive effect on weight loss, workout time, and some other numbers relevant to sport. A lot of this was looked at as a sports supplement. For a 150-pound person, this equates to around 200 to potentially 1,000 milligrams of a caffeine supplement, usually taken prior to activity. Just to note that most supplements that can contain caffeine usually contain somewhere upwards of 200 to above 400 milligrams of caffeine per serving of supplement, and many of these supplements are taken multiple times a day. Just as a note that a serious overdose of caffeine can occur at levels of caffeine ranging from 300 to 2,000 or more milligrams of caffeine taken at any one time. And of course, there's short-term and long-term risk of overdose. So what I have here is a kind of a little bit of a scale, if you will, showing just to kind of illustrate how caffeine content of different foodstuffs vary. And what I would definitely say is that most nutritional supplements that contain caffeine definitely fall even above the level containing of energy drinks. So I just thought that was kind of an interesting illustration of what different foodstuffs contain with regard to their caffeine content. So what's important to know is that because most supplements that contain caffeine contain a whole heck of a lot of it, it's interesting to note what the main symptoms of caffeine overdose are. And the most dangerous part of all of these symptoms really tends to be its effect on the cardiovascular system. So for patients who, or for people who might be at risk of having heart disease, a large amount of caffeine can stress your heart out enough to potentially cause ischemia or a heart attack. But even for young, healthy people, you can increase your risk of an irregular heart rhythm, as well as the neurologic issues of caffeine overdose, which include things like seizures and delirium. So although caffeine may be effective for weight loss, it's interesting to note that it is also one of the most risky supplements that is available on the market. So this is actually a survey of a poison control centers. And this is a table from that survey looking at the supplement type and then the frequency and severity of adverse events that were reported to poison control centers coming from dietary supplements. And what you'll notice is that caffeine, multi-component caffeine supplements, and that's so not just caffeine as a tablet, but from a variety of supplements containing caffeine, were responsible for the most total number as well as the most severe and minor adverse effects, including a death. And I wanted to illustrate that death and kind of talk a little bit about why, even though caffeine may be useful, I think that the general public tends to think that more equals better with some of these supplements, and with caffeine that can really be a very risky proposition. So this is actually the case summary of that particular death that was reported in that study looking at poison control units. And if you read through this, what you'll note is, what I would like to illustrate here, is that this gentleman was actually taking several different products that contained caffeine, only it wasn't necessarily easy for him to recognize it because, again, caffeine comes under a variety of names, and it can also be included in proprietary blends that, as of right now, are not necessarily required to report their caffeine content. In fact, it's only been very recently that if you've tried looking for caffeine content in drinks, energy drinks and soda pop and all the rest, that you've even been able to find, with much difficulty I might add, information about how much caffeine those things actually contain. So what's interesting again is that this gentleman was taking a variety of products which additively produced far, far more caffeine than he may have thought he was taking. So again, a whole variety of sources, and this guy got into serious territory very quickly and basically ended up having a stroke and dying. So to kind of tie all of this together for you is that I want you to recognize that supplements really should be evaluated on their individual merits, meaning that we really do, in order to come to a conclusion, have to look at the body of evidence that surrounds each supplement and try to come to a scientifically sound conclusion. Just because one person had a particular set of results, all that means is that's an anecdotal report, and that is the least reliable type of evidence we could ever have about any substance. I think you should all be aware that supplements are not currently regulated like drugs. Therefore, it really is buyer beware with regard to supplements. You may or may not be getting what you pay for. And believe it or not, I'll tell you, if I really wanted to make money, I would not have become a professional teacher and a professional clinician. I would have become a person who makes and markets nutrition supplements, because boy, they're getting a lot of money selling people things that probably don't work. Safety first, so please always ask a pharmacist about potential interactions or safety considerations, not only with the medications that a patient may be taking, but also with their medical conditions and some of the cautions about those medical conditions. But I do think it's interesting in that even if a supplement has limited efficacy, I think it's an interesting sort of discussion to have, theoretical discussion to have, about whether or not the placebo effect, so just the motivational and behavioral changes that occur because a person is taking something that may actually have on their outcomes. So in a sense, the placebo effect may be worth something and may actually be responsible for some of the effects that people see in real life that we are unable to replicate or capture in studies. But of course, this is all predicated on whether or not that supplement is safe. So safety first. It's also going to be very unlikely that we're ever going to have the type of information we want about supplements firsthand, again, because they don't have to go through the extensive testing before they come to market that most drugs do. So don't necessarily be an unwilling part of an experiment, meaning that supplements are going to come out, a lot of people are going to take them, and then those people are going to tell us if that supplement is indeed risky or unsafe or potentially even efficacious at all. So you're spending your money to be part of someone else's experiment in a large sense for many of these supplements. So I would love to see us all demand better quality evidence, perhaps some evidence of efficacy before we actually sort of sign on to be a taker of supplements. So a lot of interesting things to think about. I hope you've appreciated my approach to each of these supplements and the work that I've done looking into what the evidence actually is, whether it exists or not. I think you'll be surprised. The supplements with the most hype right now are really the ones with the least evidence. And the ones that have been around for a long time are the ones where that evidence has had time to gather and be analyzed for patients. So new and exciting does not always equal more effective in this world. So good luck looking at the world of supplements, and I will be taking you through some exercises in your discussion and your exams in order to kind of help you develop your own sense of how to evaluate different supplements. Thank you.